Let me ask you a very serious question. Are you still buying $30 spools of fluorocarbon line just to fight with stiff coils and missed fish all spring long? If you are, you have fallen right into one of the biggest marketing traps in the modern fishing industry. We have been brainwashed to believe that if your line is not completely invisible, the fish will simply refuse to bite. But what if I told you that the cheap, old-school monofilament your grandpa used is actually the deadliest weapon you can have on the water right now? Today, we are going to expose a massive misconception about early spring fishing. I am going to show you exactly why going backward in technology will push your catch rates forward. Get ready, because what you are about to hear goes against everything the tackle shops want you to believe. Tell me in the comments right now, have you ever lost a giant fish because your brittle fluorocarbon knot snapped in cold water? For the last 20 years, the fishing industry has aggressively pushed fluorocarbon as the ultimate solution for every single fishing scenario. They tell us it sinks faster, it is invisible underwater, and it is incredibly sensitive, and sure, in the heat of the summer on a crystal clear lake, it has its place. Because of this non-stop marketing, anglers have developed a stubborn habit. They spool up every single rod with expensive fluorocarbon and leave it there all year round. They treat monofilament like it is some ancient relic that belongs in a museum, not on a modern reel. But fishing is not a one-size-fits-all game, especially when the seasons change. Early spring brings icy water, sluggish fish, muddy runoff, and freezing temperatures. These specific conditions completely destroy the so-called advantages of fluorocarbon. When you force a summer tactic into an early spring environment, you are basically tying one hand behind your back. It is time to break that habit and look at the reality of cold water dynamics. Picture this scenario. You wake up before dawn, you grab your gear, head to the lake, and the air is absolutely crisp. There is a slight frost on the grass, and the water is icy cold. You pick up your favorite rod, the one spooled with that expensive fluorocarbon you bought because the pros on television told you it was an absolute necessity. You make your first cast of the morning. What happens? The line flies off the spool like a giant metal spring. It is stiff, it is coiled, and it feels like you are trying to cast a piece of heavy wire. This is the reality of early spring fishing with fluorocarbon. The cold temperatures turn that supposedly high-tech material into an unmanageable mess. Meanwhile, the old-school guy down the bank is using a basic, cheap monofilament. His line is flying smooth, straight, and quiet. He is not fighting his gear, he is actually fishing. We have all been conditioned to think that if we do not use the newest fluorocarbon, we will not catch anything. But in these frigid early-season conditions, that stiff line is actually working against you, ruining your casting distance, and completely killing your presentation right out of the gate. Let us talk about the biggest selling point of fluorocarbon, which is its supposed invisibility underwater. The tackle companies drill this into our heads constantly, but let us think about early spring conditions for just a minute. When the snow melts and the spring rains come pouring down, what happens to your local lake or river? The water gets muddy, stained, and completely off color. Visibility is often reduced to just a few inches. In these dark, murky waters, the fish absolutely do not care. If your line is invisible, they cannot even see your bait until it is right on top of their nose. They are relying on their lateral line and vibration to find their food, not their eyesight. So, you are paying top dollar for an invisibility feature that the current water conditions completely eliminate. Monofilament might be slightly more visible in a laboratory tank, but in a chocolate milk spring lake, the fish simply do not notice it. You are agonizing over a completely irrelevant detail while sacrificing the handling benefits that monofilament provides. Now let us move on to the sink rate. We all know that fluorocarbon sinks, and it sinks pretty fast. In the summer, getting your bait to the bottom quickly is great, but in early spring, a fast-sinking line can actually ruin your presentation. Think about how lethargic the fish are right after the ice melts. They are not chasing fast-moving prey. They want an easy meal that hovers right in their face. If you are throwing a suspending jerkbait or a shallow crankbait on fluorocarbon, the weight of the line will actually pull the nose of your bait down. It changes the natural posture of the lure and makes it dive too deep or sink when it is supposed to stay perfectly still. You will completely ruin the delicate balance of your suspending lures. Monofilament, on the other hand, is naturally buoyant. It wants to float. This slight buoyancy keeps your jerkbait suspending perfectly horizontal during those agonizingly long pauses that early spring fish require. It keeps your bait exactly in the strike zone instead of dragging it into the mud. Imagine you are reeling in a crankbait over a shallow rocky flat on a chilly morning. You feel a sudden thud because the water is so cold the fish are barely swiping at the bait. They are not fully engulfing it. If you are using fluorocarbon, which has very little stretch, the moment you feel the bite, you pull back and you instantly pull the hooks right out of the fish's mouth. There is zero forgiveness. Cold water fish often have fragile tissue around their mouths and they are striking weakly. This is where the stretch of monofilament becomes your absolute best friend. When that sluggish fish swipes at your bait, the stretch in the mono gives them an extra fraction of a second to actually get the hooks inside their mouth before you feel the tension and set the hook. That tiny bit of delay, created by the stretch of the line, is the difference between missing a giant early season base and putting it in the landing net. Monofilament acts like a shock absorber. Let us talk about tying knots when your hands are absolutely freezing. We have all been there. It is early morning, your fingers are numb, and you are trying to tie a complicated knot with stiff, brittle fluorocarbon. It is a complete nightmare. Fluorocarbon is notorious for burning itself if you do not lubricate the knot perfectly, and when it is freezing outside, getting a knot to seat correctly is incredibly difficult. You end up with a weak spot that snaps the second you set the hook on a decent fish. Monofilament is entirely different. Because it is supple and soft, it ties incredibly easily, even when your fingers feel like blocks of ice. The knots seat smoothly and hold with massive strength. You do not have to worry about the line cracking or burning itself during the tie. When you are out on a freezing, windy lake, the last thing you want to do is spend 10 minutes retying a leader knot that you do not even trust. Mono gives you reliability when the conditions are absolutely miserable. You also need to think about how line diameter affects the fall rate of your baits. Modern anglers are obsessed with using the thinnest line possible, but thicker line can actually be a massive advantage in cold water. Let us say you are pitching a lightweight jig to some emerging vegetation. You want that jig to fall as slowly as humanly possible to trigger a strike from a lazy, cold fish. Because monofilament is slightly thicker and naturally floats, it acts almost like a parachute in the water. It catches the water resistance and drastically slows down the descent of your bait. Fluorocarbon cuts right through the water and drags your bait to the bottom way too fast. By simply switching to a 15 or 20-pound monofilament, you can keep your jig gliding slowly right past the face of a suspended fish for 3 or 4 seconds longer. In early spring, those extra seconds are exactly what triggers a reactionary bite from a fish that otherwise would not have moved an inch. Let us take a moment to debunk the sensitivity myth. Yes, fluorocarbon transmits vibration very well on a tight line. But here is the secret about early spring bites. You rarely have a perfectly tight line. The fish are often picking up the bait so softly that they push slack into the line. You will not feel a tap, no matter what line you are using. You have to watch your line for visual cues. You need to see the line jump or slowly swim to the side. Clear fluorocarbon is incredibly difficult to see against the dark, glaring surface of a cold lake. High visibility monofilament, on the other hand, is like a neon sign sitting on the water. You can see the slightest twitch or movement long before you would ever feel it in the rod handle. By using a visible monofilament and tying directly to your lure, you transform yourself into a line watcher. You will start catching fish that you never even felt bite, simply because you saw the bright monofilament jump out of the corner of your eye. Another major factor is dealing with snags and cover. In the spring, water levels often rise, flooding bushes, laydowns, and thorny brush. You have to pitch your baits right into the middle of this heavy cover to find the fish. Fluorocarbon is hard, but it is also brittle. When it rubs against sharp bark or rocks, it can easily nick and snap under sudden pressure. Monofilament has incredible abrasion resistance precisely because it is softer and can deform slightly without completely breaking. It takes a beating much better than thin fluorocarbon leaders when you are dragging it over rough, abrasive wood all day long. Think of it like a hard plastic versus a rubber tire. The hard plastic cracks while the rubber bounces back. When you hook a heavy fish wrapped around a flooded stump, you want the tough, forgiving nature of monofilament to drag them out of that mess without your line suddenly pinging off like a broken guitar string. Have you ever tried to throw a topwater bait on fluorocarbon? It is an incredibly frustrating experience. As the water warms up in mid to late spring, you might want to try a popper or a walking bait during a warm afternoon. If you have fluorocarbon spooled up, the line immediately sinks, dragging the nose of your topwater lure underwater. It kills the splashing action and makes walking the dog virtually impossible. You are fighting the physics of the line on every single twitch of the rod tip. Monofilament, because it floats, sits right on the surface. It allows your topwater baits to perform exactly how they were designed to. Even if topwater is not your main strategy in early spring, having a rod spooled with monofilament gives you the versatility to throw a floating bait if the opportunity presents itself without having to completely re-spool your reel or tie on a massive, complicated leader system on the fly. Let us address the financial side of this equation because it absolutely matters. Spring fishing is tough on gear. You are dealing with snags, rocks, and ice in the rod guides. Your line takes a massive beating. If you are using a $30 spool of premium fluorocarbon every time you have to cut off a tangled mess or retie after a snag, you are literally throwing dollar bills into the lake. You start to become hesitant. You stop casting into the nasty cover where the big fish live because you are afraid of losing your expensive line. Monofilament is incredibly affordable. You can buy a massive bulk spool for 10 or 15 bucks. This affordability completely changes your mindset. You can strip off 50 yards of damaged line at the end of every trip and re-spool fresh without even blinking an eye. You will always have fresh, strong line on your reel, and you will cast fearlessly into the heaviest cover, which ultimately leads to catching far more fish. Consider the mechanical issues of using leaders in freezing weather. A lot of guys like to use braided main line tied to a fluorocarbon leader. In the summer, this is a great system, but in early spring, the water on your braided line constantly freezes in your rod guides. Every time you reel your connection knot through those iced-up guides, it takes serious damage. Eventually, that knot is going to fail, usually when you have a giant fish on the other end. By running straight monofilament, you completely eliminate the need for a connection knot. Your line passes smoothly through the guides, even if there is a little bit of ice buildup. You are removing a major point of failure from your tackle setup. In cold, miserable conditions, keeping your setup as simple and robust as possible is the absolute key to success. Straight monofilament gives you that peace of mind so you can focus entirely on the fish. There is a massive misconception about hook sets with monofilament. People think that because mono stretches, you cannot get a solid hook penetration. That is only true if you are fishing in 80 feet of water or making massive bomb casts. In early spring, a lot of your fishing is done in shallow water, specifically targeting banks that warm up quickly in the sun. You are making short, precise pitches to cover. At these short distances, the stretch of monofilament is actually very minimal, but it is just enough to be helpful. When you sweep the rod back to set the hook on a jig or a spinnerbait, the mono drives the hook home securely, but the slight stretch prevents you from tearing a giant hole in the fish's lip. Cold water fish often head shake wildly at the boat. If your line has zero give, they will use the weight of the lure to throw the hook. The stretch of mono keeps constant, elastic tension on the fish, making it incredibly hard for them to escape. Think about crankbait deflections. Early spring is prime time for throwing crankbaits against rocks and wood to trigger reaction strikes. When a crankbait hits a rock, you want it to bounce off wildly. If you are using stiff fluorocarbon, the line transmits that hard impact straight to your hands, but it also forces the bait to dig harder into the snag. Monofilament softens that impact. When your crankbait hits a rock, the line stretches slightly, allowing the bait to naturally bounce backward and deflect cleanly without instantly wedging the hooks into the wood or stone. You will actually lose far fewer crankbaits when using monofilament around heavy cover. The line acts as a buffer, giving your bait the freedom to hunt and deflect exactly the way the manufacturer intended. You get better lure action, fewer snags, and more fish in the boat. We need to talk about the psychology of the fish during the early spring transition. They are waking up from a long winter. Their metabolism is incredibly slow. They are not aggressive predators right now. They are opportunistic scavengers. They will inhale a bait slowly rather than smashing it violently. When they slowly suck in a bait on a tight fluorocarbon line, they instantly feel the unnatural resistance of the stiff line and the heavy rod. They will spit the bait out faster than you can react. Monofilament offers far less initial resistance. When the fish flares its gills to suck in your jig, the soft, supple monofilament bows and moves with the water, allowing the bait to slide effortlessly deep into the fish's mouth. By the time the fish realizes something is wrong, the bait is already buried past its crushers and you are reeling in a monster. The softness of the line directly translates to deeper, more secure hookups. Let us picture a real-life scenario on the boat. You are fishing with a buddy. He is a tackle snob, heavily invested in the fluorocarbon hype. He is spending half the morning spraying line conditioner on his reel, pulling out backlashes caused by stiff line, and complaining about the cold. You, on the other hand, brought a rod spooled with fresh 12-pound monofilament. You are making effortless casts, pitching under dock smoothly, and your lure is landing softly without alarming the fish. While he is fighting his equipment, you are systematically picking apart the shoreline. He misses a bite because his bait sank into the mud. You catch that same fish because your mono kept the bait hovering right above the bottom. This is not a theoretical debate. This is exactly what happens on the water every single spring. Practicality and manageability will always beat laboratory statistics when the weather is tough. Have you ever considered how the memory of a fishing line affects your presentation? Fluorocarbon has terrible memory. If it sits on a reel all winter, it comes off looking like a telephone cord. Even with heavy lures, those coils never fully straighten out in cold water. These coils act like tiny little shock absorbers in the worst possible way. They absorb the very subtle bites you are trying to feel, and they create immense drag in the water, destroying the natural swimming action of a swimbait or a grub. Monofilament has far less memory, especially if you stretch it slightly before your first cast. It lays perfectly straight in the water. A straight line gives you a direct, uninterrupted connection to your lure, allowing it to swim naturally and cleanly. Do not let coiled fluorocarbon ruin the realism of your carefully chosen baits. Let us explore the shock absorption during the fight. Catching a big bass in early spring is thrilling, but they fight differently than summer fish. They do not make long, burning runs. Instead, they wallow heavily near the boat, making sudden, violent head shakes. If you have a short leash of stiff fluorocarbon and a heavy rod, there is no give in the system. One violent head shake right at the side of the boat, and the hook tears completely out of the fish. This is the exact moment where monofilament shines the brightest. As the fish surges near the net, the monofilament stretches like a bungee cord, absorbing the massive shock of the head shake and keeping the hook pinned perfectly in place. You will land significantly more big fish at the boat by relying on the built-in safety net that monofilament provides. The tackle industry relies on creating a sense of inadequacy. They want you to feel like you are at a disadvantage if you are not using the latest, most expensive gear. But true angling skill is about adapting to the conditions, not just spending money. Using monofilament in early spring is not a step backward. It is a calculated, strategic choice based on physics and biology. You are actively choosing a line that floats to manage suspending baits, a line that stretches to forgive sluggish strikes, and a line that stays limp in freezing temperatures for better casting. You are outsmarting the marketing machine by using exactly what the situation demands. The best anglers in the world know when to put down the high-tech gear and pick up the reliable tools that simply get the job done. Think about the confidence factor. When you are fishing in freezing rain and brutal winds, your mental state is tested. If you are worried about your line coiling, your knots breaking, or your expensive fluorocarbon getting ruined by a snag, you are not fishing effectively, you are hesitant. When you spool up with monofilament, you eliminate all that anxiety. You know the line is cheap, you know the knots will hold, and you know it will cast beautifully regardless of the temperature. This allows you to completely zone in on finding the fish and reading the water. Confidence catches more fish than any specific brand of line ever will. Mono gives you the mental freedom to fish aggressively and creatively in the most miserable conditions Mother Nature can throw at you. I challenge you to put this to the test on your very next early spring trip. Take 2 identical rod setups, spool one with your expensive fluorocarbon, and spool the other with a fresh, inexpensive monofilament. Tie on identical jerkbaits or shallow crankbaits. Switch back and forth throughout the morning. Notice how much easier the mono casts. Watch how perfectly the bait suspends on the mono compared to sinking on the fluoro. Feel how confidently you can set the hook without worrying about a brittle break-off. I guarantee you that by the end of the day, you will be favoring the monofilament rod. You will realize that you have been fighting an unnecessary battle for years. It is time to drop the ego, ignore the flashy tackle commercials, and go back to a material that is perfectly suited for cold water dominance. Let us quickly recap everything we just uncovered. The tackle industry has done a phenomenal job convincing us that fluorocarbon is mandatory, but early spring conditions flip that entire narrative completely upside down. The cold makes fluorocarbon stiff and brittle, the muddy water makes its invisibility totally useless, and its fast sink rate completely destroys the action of your suspending baits. The biggest plot twist here is that the cheap, stretchy, floating monofilament you abandoned years ago is actually the absolute perfect tool for sluggish fish, freezing temperatures, and delicate strikes. Switching back to mono will save you money, eliminate frustration, and most importantly, put more fish in your boat when everyone else is struggling with coiled-up line. New technology is not always better technology. Thank you so much for watching and keeping an open mind. If this video made you rethink your line choices, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and join our community. Now, I want to hear from you. Are you going to strip that fluorocarbon off your reel this spring? Or are you still convinced it is the only way to go? Let us argue about it in the comments below.